Hello, welcome to Maya 101. This is Michael. I know in the last part I talked about returning to Arnold and rendering topics, but I was thinking over the Christmas break here, and I want to actually get into some animation before we go further in rendering. The idea being that once we have gone through animation and talked about that process, we could potentially animate and then render something. So we could animate, we could model something, we could perhaps rig it for animation if we go that far. We could then texture and light and animate and render. We could do the whole sequence of events to an end product. So I think animation would be a good topic to start talking about now in this Maya 101 series before we delve too far into rendering, because you can render still images a lot, but it's nice to have motion involved so you can kind of really see a rendered sequence. So with that in mind, we're going to bring up our animation user interface. So at the beginning of this sequence, this series, we kind of said, oh, we can just turn it off for now. But now we're going to talk about it so we can bring it back up. So under the Windows menu, I go to UI Elements, and I'll break this off here. And I can turn on the time slider and the range slider. So both of these UI elements are involved with animation. So animation is a big topic. Might take us a few videos to really talk much about it. So down here we see the time slider and range slider. So the first thing I'm going to do is change this drop-down menu over here. It says 24 FPS. FPS stands for frames per second. Now the frames per second that you choose, you can see here we have many options, will depend on the final output of what it is that you're creating. The frames per second of your animation, if you're creating something for, let's say, feature film. Films usually run at 24 frames per second. Now most students, most people who do online content like I do, for example, the videos are 30 FPS, so I'm going to change that to 30 frames per second, and that's primarily what you would use for an online video, like for YouTube or something like that, for your portfolio. Also for video games, though, you might have heard of games running like, oh, I got this game running at 60 FPS or whatever, 60 frames per second. So a lot of times animations may have to be created at 60 FPS as well. But for this sequence, this class, if you will, we're going to stick to 30 frames per second. Now when I change that frames per second, the numbers over here kind of change as well. Because when I was at the beginning at 24, you see that the numbers kind of shift around. Go back to 30. They shift around again. And that's okay. It's just kind of changing the way these frames are represented based on how many frames per second there are. But you'll notice here, since I've done that a few times, this beginning number over here, the frame count on this slider starts at 3. I'm actually going to change this number over here to 1. Hit enter. And then this number to 1 as well. There we go. So now I have frame 1. And then over here, we have frame 38 at the end. And we can adjust this range by clicking the slider and sliding it up here. You can see it goes all the way up to 75 at the moment. Or you can change it down here. So what's going on here is we have essentially your frames. It looks like a ruler or this line, this sequence of numbers. We have a number of frames that are available to us to use. Now the number of frames that are available can be in the thousands. When you talk about 30 frames per second, this is 1 second of animation. Like here's my frame marker here at 30. That all this right here would equal to 1 second. So if you were to say have a 1 minute long animation, that's 60 seconds. So 60 times 30 frames per, so 30 frames per second, 60 seconds. That's a lot of frames. You're talking about hundreds of frames. So it can be difficult to manage, hundreds of frames if they're all visible here in a timeline all at the same time. Let's say you have 300 frames. You see here the range slider gets much smaller because we have this large number of frames available to us, but we're only displaying, in this case, frame 1 through 46. Now I can pull this range slider bar across to view this section of the frames I have available, such as, say, 167 through 212, for example. So we're displaying just a certain number of frames on the time slider based on the range slider. So we're sliding between a range here. Hopefully that makes sense. So these two numbers on the left side over here, this first one is what frame is the first frame in available in the time slider, and this number here is the first frame that we're seeing in the range slider. So again, I can pull this range over to say frame 50, and you see we have frame 1 is available to us in our complete set of frames, but the first frame that we're viewing is frame 50. And over here, similar at the end of the range, we have 300 frames available to us, but the last frame that we're seeing in the time slider currently is frame 95. So these inner numbers, like the 50 to 95, that's what's viewable in the time slider currently, and the outer numbers, frame 1 to 300, are the frames that are available as far as what we can use. Now these numbers can change, and I can type in 2,000 frames, hit enter, and we very easily give us more frames. So we're never going to run out of frames. I can say 100. I can limit it a little bit more, and I can move this range and display all 100 frames, and that's perfectly fine to do if you're doing stuff like a short sequence or like a small action. So the number of frames available are essentially unlimited. It's just how you manage viewing those frames. You don't want to necessarily have a million frames all viewable at the same time. It can be impossible to manage. Okay, so you kind of look at a chunk of it at a time with the range slider. So I can pull this range slider in, for example. So we're just viewing 40 frames or so, for example. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So we click and drag on the time slider here, we're changing what frame we're currently on. And nothing's going to really change right now. We don't have anything in our scene. The scene's empty. There's nothing going on. But we want to make sure we understand that. We want to start at frame 1, for example. And we could type in frame 0 if we really wanted to, and put 0 here as well. And now we have a frame 0. I think you could even go negative if you really want to. Yeah, you can go into negative numbers if you really want to do that. Typically, though, the most animations that I know of, at least whenever you're working on animations, you start at frame 1. Now, I have seen people use frame 0 as like a buffer frame. They might set a keyframe or something in frame 0 to kind of anchor something, and then they'll move on through frame 1 through whatever, but they won't actually render frame 0. But we'll talk about that kind of stuff later. We're just kind of getting into the introduction of this whole concept. So let's animate something. Let's make something move. So I'm just going to create a simple object. I'm going to create objects, polygon primitives. It can be any kind of primitive, really. I'll just do a sphere, just because. All right, so we have our sphere here in our scene. I'm at frame 1. So there's several ways to create what's called a keyframe. A keyframe is whenever you set an object's position and rotation and other attributes, and set those attributes at a certain point in time on the timeline. And then you can go to another frame and change those attributes to something else. And then between the first keyframe and the second keyframe, it will transition from whatever values they were at first to whatever values they are now. So to demonstrate this, I'm just going to move this sphere over here. I'm not really worried about being too precise. And here I am at frame 1, okay? And I can press the S key. S as in set. And you can see here on the channel box, all the channels highlight red. And this is to indicate that they have been keyframed. Okay. It also indicates that the keyframe that we are currently on, the keyframe that these values have been keyframed. Okay. Because for example, if I move to frame 2 now, you'll see now these values are highlighted in a more pink color. So these values have been keyframed, but we're not currently on the keyframe. We're on a different frame. See that? If you go to frame 1, they turn red again to indicate, hey, you're currently on the keyframe that these attributes have been keyed on. So the pink means you're not currently on the set keyframe, but these values have been keyframed. Okay, and go to frame 1 here, it turns red. These values have been keyframed, and you're on the keyframe that these values have been keyframed on. I'm kind of using the same words over and over again, but hopefully it's making a little bit of sense. So here we are, frame 1. So I've pressed the S key. And what the S key does is it sets a keyframe for all the attributes of the sphere here in the channel box. You see all the translates, rotates, everything has been set. Now you don't necessarily have to press the S key to set a keyframe, and I'll demonstrate more ways to set keyframes, probably more efficient ways, we'll say. But for the beginning, we will just say, hey, press the S key, and you'll set a keyframe. If I go to frame, let's say 30, so 1 second later, right? So 30 frames per second. So you'll notice I moved the keyframe first, so now I'm at the frame 30 and I move the sphere over here. Again, these are all pink because I'm not currently on a frame that has been keyframed. But I press the S key now and it turns red. And you also notice these little red hash marks on the timeline. These are now these channels have been keyframed here at frame 30. At frame 1 and at frame 30. So you notice the sphere is moving. So at frame 1, the sphere was keyframed at this position. At frame 30, the sphere was keyframed at this position. And so if you left click and drag in between, there's the animation. There's the motion between this keyframe to that keyframe. So I press the play button over here, the right arrow, it plays through. Okay? And if we probably count this out, 1001. 1001. So it's kind of a second. You 1 Mississippi, however you want to count that second off. That's essentially what it's doing. So 1 second from here to here. So we can also go, say, perhaps in between, like a frame 15, and I can move the sphere up. Now, just because I moved it up doesn't mean anything's changed. You'll notice the channels are still pink. But if I press the S key, press the S key now I have a keyframe set. And now it's going to go between 3 keyframes, here to here to here. And you'll notice I went back to the keyframe I wanted, then I moved the sphere and pressed S. For example, if you were to go to a keyframe here, say at frame 7, and let's say you want to change it, if I move the sphere and then go to frame 15, but go back to frame 7, that movement is not saved. You have to keyframe it to be saved. Now, let's say you wanted to remove a keyframe. It's going to have this keyframe here, have a keyframe here, and have a keyframe here. By pressing the S key, I've set these frames. I can right-click here on the timeline when I go to frame 15, right-click, and I can say delete. And that will remove the keyframe that was at frame 15. Okay? So if you want to, again, it's hard for me sometimes to do it wrong, but a lot of times my students will be at frame 1. Okay, I want to move it over here, and then I'll go to frame 7, but it moves back, right? Because it's not saving that change. You have to go to the frame you want to change, and then move the sphere, and press the S key, or whatever keyframe usage that you use. You see there, now we have like a swerve going on. Okay? So this really quick and dirty way of setting keyframes on an object. And again, you can press the play button to see the animation happen. Now you notice here, in my case anyway, it's going really fast between here and here, and then a little bit slower between here and here. That's because that keyframe is set at frame 10. So if you, again, 30 frames per second, right? So essentially 1/3 of a second is the speed from this point to this point, and then 2/3 of a second from this point to that point. So it's fast and then a little bit slower. Fast, it's a little slow. See that? So the timing is a thing that takes practice, okay? And you have to be aware of that kind of timing and at 30 frames per second and what that means, okay? A lot of times it's helpful, especially when you're animating anything that a character would do, to act that out, and kind of videotape yourself or something, and maybe get a friend to record you, or set up, if you have a tripod or whatever, set it up and kind of see how long it actually takes you to, take a step or to pick something up. So whenever you have a digital character doing those actions, you can time it out more accurately as opposed to just trying to eyeball it. So, because sometimes, especially when you're first getting started, you might try to have someone, bend over, pick up a box and lift it up all within 30 frames, and it may look good when you're just, scrubbing through it like this, really slow. Okay, yeah, it looks good. He's picking it up and so on. But then when you press play, he's just zipping through the action because you did it all within 1 second. So it takes a little bit of time and practice to get that timing right. So the right click, I can delete all these frames. You can also, if I want to delete more than 1 frame at a time, I can hold shift, left click and drag on the timeline. You'll see I kind of select like a region here. Right click and delete. It'll delete all the frames within that region. So really quickly, all my frames are now gone. Okay, so pressing the S key is a quick and dirty way of setting a keyframe, but like I said, it's quick and dirty. Most of the time, you don't necessarily want to set a keyframe for every attribute. So what you can do is you can focus your keyframes on the attributes that actually change. So you notice with all these actions I've been doing, it's all been translation, right? So translate X, Y, and Z are the only thing that are really changing in all these things I've been doing so far. So if I know that, like I'm only keyframing the position of the sphere right now, instead of pressing S, I can hold down the Shift key and press the W key. Shift W. You'll notice there the shortcut for that highlights only the translate channels. Shift W. And that coincidentally, W is the move tool, right? Or the translate tool. E is the rotate tool. R is the scale tool. So Shift W keyframes all the translates. Shift E keyframes all the rotates. Shift R keyframes all the scales. So if you know ahead of time, okay, all I'm really changing right now is position, you can press Shift W and it will keyframe all three position channels. So here I am at frame 1, and I press Shift W, I go to frame 30 again, and have it go across the room again like this, Shift W, and then go up to like frame 15 or whatever, and have it go up in the air, and Shift W. And so it's all just Shift W, and I've got a little kind of a bounce or something like that. Okay, and the reason why that's important is if you were to just press S, press S here, and I press S here, I go to frame 15. Let's say I want to, scale it, and I position it up here and press S. So now it's going from a ball to this elongated thing and back to a ball again. But let's say, around here I didn't necessarily want it to not be a ball still, so I got to scale it back or something like this, and I press the S key again. So what this is just kind of messy, especially when we get into the graph editor, which we're going to get into soon. You're going to have a lot of keyframes set in the graph editor that aren't really changing or aren't doing anything, or maybe are even going against what you're trying to do. Let's say I want to do a rotation or something. I can rotate it, in between. Press Shift E, for example, here. So we're kind of flipping and doing this weird stuff. And it might be a little harder to control because you have so many keyframes being set for all these different channels that it's hard to manage. So I tend to recommend, instead of using the S key when you're setting keyframes, I just deleted all those, is to either Shift W, Shift E, or Shift R. Or another option is if for example, let's say we're going to go across on the X-axis. If you know that you're only manipulating the X-axis, you can select it, select the Translate X channel, right-click, key selected, and it only keys that one channel. I'll go to frame 30, move it over here. I can right-click, key selected, and it still animates and everything, but it only has the one channel keyframed, and I don't have all these messy keyframes for other things that don't have any bearing on what I'm trying to do. Okay, so that's going to become more useful to do it that way when you have more complex animations. Just having a ball kind of move around, it's not as big a deal to press the S key because it's very simple. But if you want to have a character like moving their arms and legs and shoulders and so on, doing different things, it becomes more apparent that keyframing these different elements in a bit more clean way without all these excess keyframes becomes much more useful. In the beginning, if you just want to press the S key, it's fine. Just kind of keep that in the back of your mind, though. You might want to eventually kind of get in the mindset of setting keyframes a little more cleanly with not so many excess keyframes. So, to kind of get started with animation, what I like to do, and it's a very typical thing to do, is to do kind of a bouncing ball motion, right? I mean, it's very, if you do any kind of search for basic animation on YouTube, you're going to find people doing a bouncing ball tutorial. And mine might not be that much different from theirs. But I am going to go through a few things on what I talk about when doing this kind of tutorial that maybe the other videos don't do. For example, I have my sphere here. I have it back to the origin. If you have a problem getting it back there, you can just delete it and create a new sphere and just have it there at the origin without any changes in the channel box. And I'll go ahead and what I'm going to do for this is I'm going to actually group the sphere. So Control G. That creates a group. You see here in the outliner I have group 1 with the sphere inside it. Now you could even group it again, but I'll just keep it like this for now. And I'll name this group movement, and then I'll name the sphere ball. And I'm actually going to texture the ball just really simply so that we can see the motion of the ball, because I think that's important. So I'm going to right click on the ball and hold, assign new material. This will show up. I'll just make a Lambert. You can do a blend too, it doesn't really matter. So here's my Lambert material. And for the color, I'm just going to apply a texture with this channel checkerboard button here. And I'm going to do a ramp. So what a ramp texture looks like is essentially this black to white gradient. I press the 6 key. It should, there it goes. Turns on the texture view and you can kind of see this color going on. So what I'm going to do though is I'm actually going to change these colors. So you can click on the little circle up here and then you can change the color. So I'll just do like a red color for example. And I'll click on this circle and do like a green color. And then I'll click in the middle to make a new one. I'll make this one, let's say, like blue. So I have this kind of rainbow effect going on. And then what I can do is I can add noise. And this gives you that kind of classic rubber bouncy ball look. You know what I mean? If you're familiar with such things. Get this kind of swirled marbled colors. Like adjusting this noise pattern. You can make these colors all kind of blend nicely. And so that way I can see that when the ball rotates, I can see the colors change. Because if it's just gray, it's really hard to see any kind of rotation to the ball. And so the idea behind this bouncing ball tutorial that we're going to do is we're going to have the ball kind of start up in the air, kind of bounce a few times and come to a rolling stop. And so having the ball be able to rotate is important. And so in order to avoid trying to rotate the ball at the same time that we're trying to throw the ball around across the room, I'm going to have all the motion of the ball, the actual movement of the ball, be controlled by a movement group. The ball itself will not be moving. The group holding the ball will be what's moving. Okay? What this also does is it separates the motion between two different nodes. Instead of having all the motion on the sphere, we can have all the movement on the group, and then the sphere can have the rotation and things like that. And I'll hopefully make more sense as we go through this. I'm also going to give myself a few more frames to work with instead of just 40 like I have here. Let's do like 100. Okay. So to get started, I have my ball is kind of colorfully colored, and I'm going to select the movement group. It's very important to select the movement group and not the ball. It's very easy to just click on the ball and start animating it whenever we actually want the movement group and not the ball itself. So if you do click on the ball to select it, press the up arrow key on the keyboard, and that will move up the hierarchy here to the movement group and select that. And make sure we always select a movement group when we're moving our ball. I'm just going to move it here to the side of the grid and move it up. So we're going to start up here, and I'll press Shift W because I've keyframed the translation of the ball. Okay, and now we're going to throw the ball across the room. So let's say around frame 90. I'm going to kind of, and you can ignore the grid for a little bit because we're going to go way out here past the grid. But let's say at frame 90, I want the ball to be over here. Let's put it kind of right there. So Shift W again. So from frame 1 to frame 90, it just kind of goes across the room like this. Okay. Now you'll notice that what I've done here is all I'm moving, if you look at the channel box as I scrub, is translate Z. Translate Z is the only thing that's moving. And so let's say I want to remove the keyframes from translate X and Y because they're not having any effect right now. So I'm actually going to right click on translate X and say break connections. Here we go. You can see that removes the keyframes from translate X. Translate Y, I can also do the same. Right click, break connections. Translate Z is the only thing that's been keyframed, and it still has the same motion. Nothing's changed. Now what I do want to do here at frame 1, okay, so back to frame 1, still have the movement group selected. I do want the ball starting up here in the air, and by moving the ball up, that is a translate Y effect, right? So I'm just going to right click on translate Y. I'm just going to make this a round number of 15 just to keep it kind of even, or just without worrying about a lot of decimal points right now. So I can select Translate Y, right click, and key selected. So here at frame 1, Translate Y is 15. So then I'm going to kind of imagine in my head, I'm just imagining in my head, I'm going to want this ball to kind of hit the ground and bounce kind of like this until it kind of comes to a rolling stop. So that's the idea, that's the plan, right? That's the plan though, right? So make sure I select my movement group. And so around, let's say, and again, I'm kind of looking at how the ball is moving across the room around, let's say here, I want the ball to hit the ground. So I'm going to move it down, and I can go to a side view, because I'm going to pretend like the grid is the floor. So I move it down, and it hits the grid right there. So this is shift. I'm going to select Translate Y, right click, and key selected. I did not key Translate Z, you might notice, because Translate Z is taking the ball across the room. And so here you can see I'm getting this kind of swooping down motion. And that's okay. We're just setting keyframes for the ball striking the ground. So it's going to hit the ground, and we're going to change that swooping motion to be more going up like this, kind of the opposite. But right now it's swooping in and coming to the ground here. And then let's say it comes, again, kind of looking at my distance here, all the way over there. So between here and here, we want it to bounce a few times. So I'm going to say it hits the ground and bounces, and we can always change this later, by the way. Let's say it hits the ground again around frame, we'll say 45. So I can again right-click Translate Y and key selected. So you know it's not going up yet, where it's just keyframing those bounces in between. So from 20, say 23 here to 45, and then let's say it bounces again to about, say, frame 60. So Translate Y, right-click, key selected. Boink, and then it kind of bounces again and comes to a rolling stop. Let's say around frame, that was 60. Let's do like 70, 72. I'm just eyeballing this. We can always change this later. So there's a big bounce, and a smaller bounce, and a smaller bounce, and it kind of rolls to a stop. You might say, okay, that's great, but there's no bouncing happening yet, right? It's just kind of swooping through here. Well, we're going to add the bounces in next, but let's look at what I want to show you is the graph editor. So we go to Windows, Animation Editors, Graph Editor. So this is an animation editor. If you do much animation at all, this is something that you're going to be seeing a lot. And just to kind of get my view to be a little bit manageable, I'm going to close this and actually go to Panels, Saved Layout, and I'm going to say here it is, Perspective/Graph. There we go. So by splitting the view up like this, I can see my perspective view, I can see the ball, and I can see the graph. So let's look at this graph editor and kind of understand what's happening here. So I have the movement group selected, and whatever you have selected, that you're going to see the keyframes for that selected node in the graph editor. If I deselect everything, I won't see anything in the graph editor. If I click on the ball has no keyframes, so I don't see anything. Click on the movement group though, I'm starting to see some stuff. So here's Translate Z, and here's Translate Y. So Translate Y, you'll remember we started up here in the air, we came down, and we set some keyframes. And these little diamond shapes are those keyframes. Translate Z, we started at the beginning over here on the left, and it moved all the way across the room over here to the right. So by default, what Maya tends to do is it kind of makes these curved tangents, or curved, the technical term is interpolation, and that's the motion between keyframes. So this motion happening from this keyframe to this keyframe is being interpolated, or you could also say perhaps it's being assumed that the motion is going to be this kind of curved, swooping, smooth motion. And for a ball bouncing in the air and kind of hitting the ground and kind of bounces sharply and bounces up, that's not necessarily a smooth motion, that's more of a sharp motion. So we can adjust this a bit. Because again, right now we're getting this kind of swooping nature happening through here. And so we can play with this graph editor. You can control the camera by holding down the Alt and right mouse button to zoom, and left, Alt middle I should say, to pan. So it's just like a regular Maya camera. There's no rotate, of course, because it's not a 3D view, it's a 2D view. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to select this keyframe. Just kind of click and drag a box around it. And I'll go up here to the tangents menu, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to say break tangents. And the reason why, and I'll show you, whenever you select a keyframe, it might be a little hard to tell. Let me zoom in. Again, it might be difficult to see, but there's these little bars or lines coming off the left and right side of the keyframe. And only the one you have selected. So this one does not have it. Like select it though, you can see these little gray lines up here, these little handles on the side. These are the tangent handles. So this keyframe I have not done that break tangents command on. So I can select this one. And once I have the keyframe selected and the tangent handles have been displayed, I can then drag a box around the handle and grab that. And then to adjust this handle, I middle click and drag. And you see here how it kind of shifts and changes the graph. And so by doing this, you're going to see the ball kind of wobble around. Watch this for a second. You see that? That's because I didn't change the keyframe's position on the timeline. It's still there at frame 44. All I did was rotate the tangent handles to change how the keyframes are being interpolated between each other. I'm changing the path between keyframes because Maya handles all the interpolation. You set the keyframes, you're setting these points, and Maya is doing the in-between from one point to the other. And you have to tell Maya how to change the shape from one point to the other because it doesn't necessarily know by default. It just kind of does its own thing. And so these tangent handles gives you a chance to manipulate the shape of the path between keyframes. Okay, let me undo those changes so it goes back to being flat. See this? It goes right through there. Now this one over here, I broke the tangents. I pressed that tangent menu, break tangents. So when I select one side, the other side is not also changed. It's not like a seesaw because this one's like a seesaw, right? When one goes up, the other one goes down. Well, I broke this one, so now when one side goes up, the other side stays put. So let me undo those changes. Okay, so now back to this. So the reason why I selected the key with the tangents, break tangents, is so now I can get like this sharp bounce. So I'm changing this path. Again, you have to select the keyframe first, the tangent handles then appear, then you can select the handle, middle click and drag. See that? I'm going to leave the one on the right alone. So the left one though, I'm grabbing that left one and I'm adjusting its position. So now instead of the ball kind of swooping down to the keyframe, what I want to have happen is for it to kind of arc down and strike sharply and then go to the right. Just like this curve, this shape here. That's essentially what we're getting. And I can, of course, play with this some more. I can do this. I can play with this handle as well. And maybe we want the ball to kind of go up and then back down. See that? We can play with these shapes here to get different looks. Okay. I probably want to keep it kind of just flat, arc out like this. Okay. So what I'm going to do is actually break the tangents for all of these keyframes because I want this kind of sharp bouncing between each one. So I'll select all the keyframes that are left over here, tangents, break tangents. So now they've all been broken like this. And so here's the trick that I do for a bouncing ball like this. I select these two keyframes so I see the handles for both, and then I'll select both these inner handles, middle click and drag up. So I get this very natural looking hump in the middle. And you'll see as I middle click and drag around, the shape changes. So you want to kind of try to stay in the middle a little bit and create like this arc. I'll do the same for over here. I'll left click and drag these two keyframes. The tangent handles both appear. Left click and drag in the middle and drag up. So my bounces are going to get smaller and smaller as I go through until eventually it just kind of rolls to a stop, right? So this I just kind of eyeball this, just play it back and see what it looks like. See, very quickly we're getting a pretty nice looking bounce effect. And you can adjust the heights. If you think it's going too high, you can just go back and do the same kind of adjustment again and lower down that arc, or make it higher. Just depends on what looks natural to you. The quicker the ball loses energy, it's also kind of implying a mass to the ball. Like if you think of a bowling ball, if you try to bounce a bowling ball, you might get it to bounce a little bit, but it's going to come to a stop really soon and roll, right? It's not going to bounce a whole bunch before it just starts rolling because it's so heavy and dense. Meanwhile, like a tennis ball, though, might bounce all over the place before it finally loses energy and comes to a stop and rolls. So depending on how many bounces you have and how high they are and so on, you're kind of implying mass and how heavy and or how bouncy and light this ball is. That's where kind of the magic comes in with this kind of animation. You can really imply a lot of information to the viewer just by how much this object bounces and how hard it hits and so on. So I think this boing boing, it kind of comes to a stop. We could even maybe have another little bounce here. Like if I go to frame like between 60 and 72 here, or actually you could do like another little bounce between these two and then have it come to a roll over here. Let's try that. So grab both of these, grab the handles in the middle, and kind of go up just a little bit, just a tiny bit. Rewind and play. There we go. So we got a little bit of a bounce there before it stops bouncing and just rolls. Now another thing you can do is you can select these keyframes and you can hold the shift key, middle click and drag left and right to change their position on the ground. Like if you want them to happen sooner or later. Like this, for example. We're going to get this really heavy drop at the beginning and then it gets a long bounce at the end. So timing, again, is a big factor. Kind of play around with their positions until it looks right to you. Translate Z is also into play because notice it's kind of just curved going on through here. So what we're actually seeing, what I'm picturing as it seems to be really slow at the beginning, that's because the Translate Z, the motion from left to right, starts slow and speeds up. See this? That's why we're getting this kind of motion here. So what I could do to kind of help with that is make this just a linear straight curve. So a quick way to do that is to select the curve, tangents, and say linear. That makes it a straight curve. This is a Translate Z curve we did. So we go back here now, rewind and play. There we go. That's more like what I was expecting. So I was trying to fix that floatiness with the Translate Y curve when it was actually a Translate Z curve that was affecting it. So sometimes you have to just get to that point where you're like, this is not working like I thought it should, and then finally figure out, oh, all right, I'm on the wrong curve for that change to take place. Okay, so now, again, you press the F key, it'll kind of frame your view a little bit, so I get this a little bit more elongated graph here. All right, let's see. So now that we have that in place, I can adjust this a bit more, move this a little bit further over here. Again, let's get a little floaty. Move this one over too. So you can see here that you can really spend some time fine-tuning. There we go, it looks decent. Let's see. This last hump might be a little too high. I'm going to make this almost flat at the stop. Kind of make it almost flat through here. Try again. There we go, that's not too bad. I mean, we can spend a lot of time continuing to adjust things, but I think we're going to stick with that. Okay, so we got our bounces. We have our motion of the ball. So I'm pressing the space bar here so we kind of zoom in and see. Obviously the ball is not rotating yet, right? And so because we have all the movement on this group, I can grab the ball. Okay, I'm just going to grab the ball itself, not the group, and I can keyframe its rotation. So let's go back to frame 1. And we're rotating. Let's see, let's check what direction we're rotating in. This is the rotate X axis that we're rotating in right now. So I can select rotate X, rotate X, rotate X axis, there we go, at frame 1 here, right click and key selected. And then at the end of my animation, when it gets to frame 90, let's say it rotates through a few times. So 360 degrees is one rotation. So 2 rotations would be, I'm bad at math, 720, right? And then another 360 on top of that is 1080. Okay, let's do 1080. So 1080, enter. And then select the rotate X here at frame 90, right click and key selected. So rewind and play. So now we're getting some rotation. I might be rotating a little too fast perhaps. So maybe instead of 3 rotations, we change that to 2. So instead of 1080 at the end, let's go to frame 90, change this to 720, right click, key selected, rewind, play, see what it looks like. So another thing we might do with the motion here is right now it's starting out really strong and then it just kind of stops. So we can do a little bit of a curve here, which actually want to curve it up a little bit this way. There we go. So now it kind of comes to a kind of a slowing down stop as opposed to a sharp stop like it did. Another thing I like to avoid is you'll notice, I'll rewind this a little bit and look at it here. The sphere is upright. You see the kind of red spots at the top, green spots at the bottom. And if we go to the end, oh, lo and behold, it stopped at the same position it started at. So one thing I do like to try to do is put in a little bit of less mechanical movement in there because we did 2 complete full rotations. And if you were to throw a ball and let it bounce and come to a stop, it's more than likely not going to stop at the same exact rotations that it started on, right? So what we could do, instead of being from 0 to 720, which is 2 complete, full, precise rotations, I could say at frame 1, maybe the rotation, instead of being 0, it starts at, say, I don't know, 45, or not 45, just keep away from like 45-degree increments. We can do like a rotation at 24, how about that? And set a keyframe there. So it's not starting completely upright and straight. And go to frame 90, instead of going to 720, maybe it's like 736, just to have another off number. So press play. Still looks pretty upright. It might be just too close to 720. Let's do like 800. A little bit more than 2 full rotations. There we go. So it's a little bit off in that sense. Okay. So we have our bounces happening. They're going across the screen here. We've got some rolling going on. Now the last thing I'd like to do is add in a little bit of a squash to the ball. So the way we're going to do that is I'm going to select the ball. Now the ball itself is rotating. So if I add what's called a squash deformer to the ball, the deformer is going to rotate with the ball. So I can add the squash deformer instead to the movement group. The movement group does not rotate at all. It's just moving up and down and left to right. So it's not going to rotate. The ball is rotating, but the group doesn't. So if I squash the group, the ball will squash no matter what rotation it's at. So that we won't get any kind of weird, strange rotation going on or squashing going on. So with the group selected, again, the group selected, I'll go to Deform, Nonlinear, Squash. Okay. So this squash handle gets applied and connected to the group. Now it's not connected to the group though, I want to make sure that's clear. It's just applied to the group. If I want it to actually move with the group, I need to actually have the handle go with the group when it moves. Because right now if I move, the handle stays in place. See that? It's not actually moving with the ball. So I'm going to middle click and drag the squash one handle onto the movement group and let go. I'm actually going to delete this blue pencil object. We don't need that anymore. So now it's going to move with the group. See that? That's what I want. And so the squash handle, if I click on it, we have over here under inputs, squash one. These are all the factors involved. The factor is what makes it actually squash. See that? I'll undo that. So if I go to the first frame where we have an impact, which looks like it's frame 16 in my case, after adjustments, yours might be different. So now I want to adjust the squash to make it look like the ball squashes downward onto the floor before bouncing and springing back up. So I'm going to press the space bar. I'm actually going to change, instead of doing the graph editor, I'm going to go to panels. Let's go back to, here we go, this button here under the toolbox here, this 4. This goes back to the 4 thing here. And let's go to, let's see, I think it'll be the side view. Yep. Let's look at it in the side view at frame 16. I press the 6 key again to get textures there. I'll just space bar to pull that back up. Okay. So what I wanted to have happen is for the squash handle to squash the ball downward toward the ground. Now if I click on the squash and adjust the factor right now, you see how if I squash it right now, it rises up away from the ground, which is not actually what I want to have happen. So what I can do instead is I'm going to move the squash handle down to the ground. I can actually grid snap it to the ground. Now if I do the factor, you see it's almost there. We get this kind of UFO shape because what's happening, press the 4 key, is the top of the handle is only going to about here on the ball. So what we have here down here is high bound and low bound. So I can increase the high bound to encompass more of the ball. See that? So now if I do the factor again, now it's squashing down toward the ground. See that? So here we are at frame 16. So I don't want the ball to start squashing before, and actually I'm actually looking at it from the opposite side. That's why it's going to the left this time. But if I don't want the ball to start squashing before it hits the ground. So if I go to frame 15, the frame before it hits the ground, here's my factor, which controls the squash, right? So I'm going to right click on factor and key selected with the factor set at 0. So the squash will be at 0 at frame 15. If we go to frame 16, I think I might have undone my high bound, so bring that back up. There we go. I want to see that handle above the ball there. And then I can squash the ball down. And how far you squash it really depends on how dense you want the ball to feel. The more it flattens out, the more like squashy and floppy it is, almost like a ball of gelatin or something. And the more stiff it is, the much more dense it feels. So I'm going to do somewhere like this. So like it's a bouncy ball that's like a kickball. There we go. If you're familiar with those, like a kickball kind of density to it. So it's going to squash a little bit like this. I can right click on factor and say key selected. So it goes down, squashes, but now it's going to come back up. You'll notice it's still squashed because I haven't set the squash at frame 16, but I haven't told it to not squash anymore. So at frame 17 or even maybe 18, I could actually stretch it. So like it squashes down when it hits the ground, and then it springs up. Let's say I adjust this factor to go higher than 0. So it's springing up like this. Right click, key selected. And then as it continues to fly, it's going to even out back to 0. So press key selected. So you see I have several keys here. Press play. It's very subtle. But whenever we animate this, we can even do some more things to it. We can make it look more. We can even have, for example, let's go back up a little bit more. Let's say frame 16 we squash down. If we look back at the squash handle, we do have a couple other options here we can play with. We have expand. You see here, for example, we may have it expand outwards some more. We also have max expand position, and you can see here that's this line going across. If we have that max expand position kind of set more toward the ground, and then we increase the expand a little bit, we kind of have that squash kind of anchor or bias a little bit downward. Keyframe the factor again with this new value. Key selected at frame 16. So it comes down, it kind of flattens out, and then as it comes up, it springs upward. I can even rotate this handle this way, so it kind of springs toward the direction it's moving in. Now, if I do that, let me undo that real quick. I would need to keyframe that rotation so that here it's flattened straight down, or I could bias it a little bit, but you don't want to go too far. It gets really weird. So I probably just keep it straight, and I'll Shift E to keyframe the rotation of my squash handle. And then as it's bouncing up, I can tilt it this way, Shift E, and then as it gets kind of evened out, I will tilt it back to its default position of 0. Shift E, like this. See that? And then we repeat that again a little bit, going this way. So whenever again it's going to hit the ground here at frame 38 in my case. So the frame before that is where I do all these things to kind of set it up. I'll keyframe the factor. I'll keyframe the rotations. And at frame 38, again, rotations are still set to there. I can adjust the factor to squash down. Like this. Right click, key selected. And then as it goes this way, I'll rotate the squash handle a little bit and adjust the factor to go the opposite way so it kind of stretches like this. So I need to keyframe that rotation, Shift E, right click and key selected on factor, and then it should even out. So around frame 41, I'll put this all back to 0. This is back to 0. Keyframe that factor, Shift E to keyframe the rotation of this handle again. So there's my second little squash there. And then it's going to hit again. And again, every bounce should be a little bit less of a squash than the last one. So this last bounce here, the frame before, again, keyframe all these things. Right click, deselected. The squash itself, we'll just make it just a little bit, not even, hardly even matters. Key selected. And then as it bounces back up, we'll just put it back to 0. Not worry about the rotation anymore in that case. And it kind of rolls to a stop. Okay, let's see what this looks like. So rewind it. If you want to, you can select the handle and hide it. Control H to hide it so you don't see it. And play. So that squash is a little bit dramatic. I might could tone it down a little, depending on how realistic we want to be. But yeah, for the most part, though, we have our bouncing ball, we have a squash, and you'll hopefully see the importance of the movement group. If that squash handle was applied to the ball and the ball is rotating, the squash handle will also rotate. And it makes it a little bit difficult to control the direction of the squash because you have to have to kind of counterbalance the rotation against the ball's motion. By applying it to the movement group, we don't have to worry about that at all. We have this kind of a handle that we can apply these things to. All right, well, I'm going to call this first kind of foray into animation done for now. We're going to look back at this some more as we go forward. Hopefully you're enjoying the series. Again, if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to ask below, and I'll do my best to answer. And thanks again for watching, guys. I'll talk to you later.